The ancient myths given to all the cultures of the world clearly teach us that the natural resources of the earth are gifts of the divine realm. These gifts include the rivers, and the rain, and the fertile soil, and the pleasant harbors, and the growing grains, and the grapes that give wine, and the olives that yield both food and oil, and the bounty of the ocean, and of the forests, and of the pastures. The ancient myths also teach that the various gifts given to individual men and women, such as skill at music, or skill at art, or skill at engineering and inventing, or skill at trade crafts such as metalworking or the building trades, are likewise the gifts of the gods. And to forget that important truth and to dishonor the source of those gifts was always to invite disaster, as many ancient myths dramatize most vividly. The ancient myths also teach quite clearly that each and every child born into the world is allowed to do so only by the blessing of the divine realm. For example, in the myths of ancient Greece, we're explicitly told that no woman delivers a new baby into the world except that the goddess Artemis is present and allows the birth to happen. An ancient hymn to that goddess calls her, quote, helper at childbirth. You help women in labor, though you know not what labor is, end quote, and calls her the goddess of swift birth and the nurturer of mortal youths. Thus it's clear that the gifts of the divine realm to any land or nation include not only the woods and the meadows and the rivers and the mountains and the beaches and the harbors and the fields full of grain and the minerals under the earth, but also the people whom the gods allow to be born into that land, and to whom the gods give their various gifts. And so, this Labor Day, I would like to address the obvious fact that for a society to deliberately waste these gifts of the divine realm through policies that are detrimental to labor and to the ability of men and women to find meaningful work through which they can express the unique gifts and talents given to them would undoubtedly be seen by all the ancient cultures as an affront and an insult to the gods themselves. And yet that's exactly what we see going on in society around us, not just in recent months through the imposition of policies designed to deliberately wipe out small businesses, but through policies which actually go back for over a century, which are designed to deliberately create unemployment as a way of keeping wages and benefits lower than they would be otherwise, deliberately commoditizing labor. As Karl Polanyi observed in his groundbreaking 1944 book entitled The Great Transformation, and as Professor Michael Hudson has just discussed in an important article published just this week entitled Debt, Land, and Money, From Polanyi to the New Economic Archaeology, which explains why labor is not a commodity, cannot be treated as a commodity without dire consequences, and how this critical question is tied to the subject of the nature of money and credit, and why money is also not a commodity. Let's listen to a short speech by Margaret Thatcher from 1983, at which time she was serving as Prime Minister of the United Kingdom and making some statements about the origins of public money which display either shocking ignorance or shocking dishonesty. I'm not sure which. But which she may well have believed because the sentiments she's expressing are widely taught and widely believed, even though they are ridiculous on their very face. And politicians of all different parties in many different countries continue to repeat these kinds of assertions to this day because this false picture of money is very useful to a specific constituency. Have a listen.
One of the great debates of our time is about how much of your money should be spent by the state and how much you should keep to spend on your family. Let us never forget this fundamental truth. The state has no source of money other than the money people earn themselves. If the state wishes to spend more, it can do so only by borrowing your savings or by taxing you more. And it's no good thinking that someone else will pay. That someone else is you. There is no such thing as public money. There is only taxpayers' money.
Now, you may have found yourself nodding your head in agreement with those statements about money, but if so, that's because you've been told flat out lies all your life about the way money is created into the economy. It does not come from the people and get paid up to the government. How on earth could it? When it comes time to pay taxes, working people do not turn in money that they created themselves, that they originated themselves. The government would not accept that at all. And if you tried it, you would get into pretty serious legal trouble. The government only accepts money which they themselves issue, or which their partners in money creation, that is to say, the banks, created in an account somewhere in the first place. Perhaps the best person to explain this fact of money is Warren Mosler, who was a very successful professional money manager and who became one of the founding thinkers of what is called modern monetary theory, or MMT. Although, as Michael Hudson explains in his latest article, this fact of money creation has been the case all the way back to ancient times and was even explicitly recognized by Aristotle and mentioned by him. So we could also call it ancient monetary theory, or AMT, as well. In an excellent and very readable book entitled The 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy, which he makes available for free on his website at Mosler Economics under the heading Mandatory Readings, Warren Mosler explains, imagine a new country with a newly announced currency. No one has any. Then the government proclaims, for example, that there will be a property tax. Well, how can it be paid? It can't until after the government starts spending. Only after the government spends its new currency does the population have the funds to pay the tax. And you can find that on page 24. It's very similar, he points out, to Super Bowl tickets that you hand in when you go to the Super Bowl. The Super Bowl organizers have to put out the tickets before you can hand them in at the game. You don't make Super Bowl tickets yourself and then use your own homemade ticket to get in. They only accept the tickets that they themselves put out into the public in advance. And it's the same with taxes. And as Warren Mosler explains, the government doesn't spend your taxes when you turn them in. They actually get shredded if you pay them in cash. Just like the Super Bowl ticket, which might have cost $1,000 or more, just gets torn in half when you turn it in at the Super Bowl, or it gets punched so you can't use it again. This is not a debatable point, by the way. This is the way that money is created by governments, whether you yourself approve of that or not, or whether Margaret Thatcher herself approved of it or not. That's the way that it actually works. And as Michael Hudson explains in his latest article, and also in his most recent book, this is how money was created even back in ancient times as well. It wasn't first created by the people and then given up to the governments so that the governments could spend it. It was created by governments and then given to the people, and they demanded some of it back in taxes. Professor Hudson writes, quote, Aristotle long ago noted that the Greek term for coinage, nomisma, is based on the root nomos, the root of our term numismatics, meaning law. Numismatics means coinage, and nomos, the root, means law. I'm interjecting there. Back to the quote. What gave monetized commodities currency above all was being accepted as payment of taxes or fees for palace and temple goods and services. End quote. But there is a school of economics that doesn't want governments to have the power to create money in order to provision itself or themselves, and in order to provide social services, and in order to ensure full employment. And they have a fairy tale about money being created by private enterprise or private individuals who started using metals such as gold and silver and exchanging it amongst themselves, and then later that got taxed. As Professor Hudson points out, left out of account is where this metal is supposed to have come from. Throughout all of antiquity, it was refined in the temples, which guaranteed its degree of purity, while the palace sponsored the trade to obtain silver and gold. Private individuals bartering cannot be a realistic explanation. A long thread of denunciation of merchants and creditors using false weights and measures runs from Babylonian wisdom literature through the Bible. A light weight for lending or selling, and a heavy weight for debtors repaying and for buying. This literary record makes it clear that even commodity money could never be left to private individuals, because doing so would have opened the gates for creditors and tradesmen to act crookedly. Effective public authority always has been necessary to rein in fraud and guarantee fair dealing in market exchange. That is why fraudsters seek to dismantle government's regulatory ability whenever possible, using the hypocritical slogan of free markets, end quote. Now, let's get to the critical question of how much money a government should create. And let's relate it to Labor Day and the intentional creation of unemployment, which is a scourge on any society and which has tremendous negative consequences, and which, as I have said up front, would have been seen in any ancient culture as a tremendous insult to heaven and a deliberate wasting of the gifts bestowed by the divine realm upon a land or a nation. Unemployment is a direct result of government either spending too little, which means creating too little money, or taxing too much, which means destroying too much money, or a combination of both. When the government wants to spend, it creates money in an account somewhere. When you or anyone else pays a tax, that money is actually removed from the system, removed from any account and destroyed altogether. The government does not use that money to spend whatsoever. So why does the government tax at all? This is usually the next question anyone would ask. The reason is in order to make room for the government to spend and purchase things that are for sale in the economy without causing runaway inflation. If the government did not tax in order to make room for its own spending, then when the government tried to purchase anything, such as purchasing rifles and bullets for the infantry, or purchasing ships for the Navy, or purchasing desks and computers for administrative offices, or purchasing the labor of someone who it needs in the Army or in the Food and Drug Administration, then that spending would drive the prices of those goods and services upwards to infinity if it didn't remove some of the spending power of the private sector first. Warren Mosler explains on page 30 of his book how this works. Think of the economy as one big department store full of all the goods and services we all produce and offer for sale every year. We all get paid enough in wages and profits to buy everything in that store, assuming we would spend all the money we earn and all the profits we make. And if we borrow to spend, we can buy even more than there is in that store. As an aside, that would create inflation. So lending can create inflation, or credit expansion can create inflation. Back to the quotation. And if we borrow to spend, we can buy even more than there is in that store. But when some of our money goes to pay taxes, we're left short of the spending power we need to buy all of what's for sale in the store. This gives government the room to buy what it wants, so that when it spends what it wants, the combined spending of government and the rest of us isn't too much for what's for sale in the store. However, when the government taxes too much relative to its spending, total spending isn't enough to make sure everything in the store gets sold. When businesses can't sell all that they produce, people lose their jobs and have even less money to spend, so even less gets sold, and then more people lose their jobs, and the economy goes into a downward spiral we call a recession. Keep in mind that the public purpose behind government doing all this is to provide a public infrastructure. This includes the military, the legal system, the legislature, and the executive branch of government, etc. So there is quite a bit that even the most conservative voters would have the government do. End quote. So, if the government wants to spend money in order to provision itself, which it does by simply creating money in accounts, if it does not tax, it will create inflation. Because if it buys a bunch of loaves of bread, for example, but doesn't remove any purchasing power, then there will be a fight over the remaining bread among the rest of the people trying to buy it, which will drive the price of bread upwards unless the government removes the right amount of purchasing power first through taxes. But if it removes too much purchasing power by taxing too much, then bread will get left on the shelves of the store because there won't be enough purchasing power left to buy that bread. And even though labor is not actually a commodity, you can think about it as being in this department store, we're not just selling bread, we're selling all the goods and services of the entire economy, haircuts, hours of labor, everything for sale in the economy, including people's labor, and so that will not get purchased for employment if the government taxes too much and spends too little. It'll be left, the employment, the labor will be left unhired. The government could fix that problem by either reducing the taxes so that all the bread gets bought and all the labor gets hired by the purchasing power out there in the private sector, or the government could also fix it by spending more and buying up all the extra bread and hiring all the extra labor and giving jobs to the unemployed, the extra labor, whose unemployment it actually caused by its policy, its fiscal policy of the amount it taxes and the amount it spends. It creates unemployment. So unemployment is a direct result of the government taxing too much or spending too little. And by the way, taxing does not automatically mean income tax. Income tax is largely taxing labor. As Michael Hudson explains elsewhere, it'd be better to untax labor and untax industry and business production, and instead tax what the classical economists said to tax, which was rent-seeking behavior and rentier income, unearned income, which I discussed in a previous video. Taxes are necessary to give the government room to provision itself and to buy things in the department store and to remove some purchasing power so it has room to do that. But you want to tax behaviors as much as possible. You want to tax behaviors that you don't want, things that drain the economy, such as rent seeking, not the things that you do want, including labor and industrial production. And the same warning also goes for the government spending. It should be for productive infrastructure, not for the benefit of rent-seeking behavior and monopoly interests, which is how government spending is often used today. And it should absolutely be for the employment of anyone who wants employment and cannot find employment in the private sector at any given time for whatever reason. Remember, government policy creates unemployment by taxing too much and spending too little, leaving loaves of bread unable to be bought and labor unable to be hired. So MMT economists, including Warren Mosler, are basically unanimous in declaring the absolutely critical policy of a jobs guarantee program. a completely voluntary program where those who want a job can always get one at a set, livable wage that includes health care benefits and paid time off. As Warren Mosler argues, that the wage would never go up. So if you want to earn more, then you go out into the private sector. But there's always available to you a voluntary, nobody's forced to do it, a voluntary jobs guarantee program. These jobs could be created at the local level based on local or regional or state needs and funded from the federal level where the money is created. You could fix roads. Just some ideas are that you could fix roads and infrastructure with such a program. You could fix antiquated public water systems. You could modernize the electrical grid. You could create a first-rate postal system with far lower fees for shipping. You could add safe, separate paved bike and pedestrian paths next to every road. And you could even put in barriers so that pedestrians and bikers are protected from cars. You could improve public school staffing. You could have places where you grow more local produce. The possibilities are actually endless. Warren Mosler likes to call this policy a transition jobs program because it would enable those who are unemployed now to build work history that would help them to find jobs in the private sector if they desire, which is basically impossible to do once you've been unemployed for too long. So what could possibly be the downside to such a program? Why would anyone argue against such an idea as a jobs guarantee program or a transition job program? Because argue against it, people definitely do. And the first objection that they raise, as you might imagine, is we can't afford it. Oh, they love to come up with all these lavish social ideas, but that's wasting taxpayers' money. That's the first objection. We can't afford it, using those arguments that we just heard articulated by Margaret Thatcher. Governments need to tax in order to spend. That argument is just plain false. The real reason that some people use that argument, even though it can easily be shown to be false, is that they don't want to say the real reason. Because the real reason is very ugly and very immoral. The real reason is that having unemployment around helps drive down wages that employers have to pay to workers. If you knew that there was a jobs guarantee program that paid a living wage with decent health care and decent paid time off, then you wouldn't be forced to stay with an employer who exploited you by paying less than that or by offering less benefits than that. But if you were afraid of being unemployed for a long time or even of winding up on the streets because you couldn't find a job, you might stay with a job that's exploitative or that doesn't allow you to really use all your unique gifts to their fullest. So unemployment is actually a deliberate policy because it's well known how to fix it. And the resources to fix it are available. And actually, if you had a guaranteed jobs program, it would help all kinds of businesses. It's really very short-sighted to have a deliberate policy of unemployment. And so we actually know how to fix unemployment and the resources are actually available, but those resources include government spending. And as Michael Hudson explains in his latest article, there are those who want to deliberately restrict government spending for the benefit of the people, and restrict government spending for the providing of jobs, and restrict government spending for the providing of infrastructure, because less government spending actually helps certain specific constituencies, in particular creditors, those who loan money. If government spent more, people would have to borrow less. If government created more spending out into the economy, then the alternate place that you can get dollars created, because they have a license to create dollars, is from banks. And banks make money by creating loans. Creating money by creating loans. And so the more the government does that, the less the banks have room to do that, and therefore the less the banks make. So you can think about it, for instance, with college tuitions. If the government spent to make college free at all public universities to everyone who's academically qualified so that they could use their divinely given gifts to their fullest potential, then banks would lose out on a whole lot of student loans because there'd be a whole lot less demand for student loans. There might still be demand for student loans for private universities, but if government subsidized or even made completely free public universities, which is what many of the original charters of those public universities, such as the University of California, state specifically, then banks would lose out on a whole lot of money from student loans, which now are in the trillions and are completely devastating an entire generation. And the same goes for a lot of other kinds of debt. If governments were to make a jobs guarantee program, and if governments were to spend what they should in order to create infrastructure, there'd be a lot less bank-provided debt out in the general public. And when governments are restricted from properly providing infrastructure, there are related constituencies who are quick to argue for the privatization of that infrastructure, which basically means selling it off to investors who then get the privilege of charging a private tax on everyone who needs to use that infrastructure. That's another form of rent-seeking behavior, what the classical economists called rentier behavior or rent-seeking behavior, charging a private tax, which is very lucrative for the privatizers, but very deleterious to society as a whole. And so these constituencies want to argue that money should be a commodity tied to a commodity such as gold, so that governments are hampered in their ability to spend enough to prevent unemployment and to provide infrastructure for the society as a whole. In fact, Margaret Thatcher famously argued that there is no such thing as society in a notorious interview from 1987. And that statement was no accident. It's not being taken out of context. She's expressing the desires of the constituency that she represented. It's an actual position of those who want to dismantle the ability of governments to, going back to that quotation from Michael Hudson, to, quote, rein in fraud and guarantee fair dealing in market exchange. That is why fraudsters seek to dismantle government's regulatory ability whenever possible, using the hypocritical slogan of free markets, end quote. That's Michael Hudson's quotation that I cited earlier. Falsely arguing that money is a commodity has the direct effect of falsely turning labor into a commodity as well. Neither labor nor land nor money are actual commodities. Labor and land are not produced, but rather are bestowed as nature's gift upon a nation. And money is created, as we said, by a social contract. Those who want to hobble the ability of governments to spend can be shown by a clear line of argument to be arguing against the ability of governments to raise the standards of living of the entire society and to enable men and women to use the gifts that were given to them. And the shuttering of thousands of businesses across the country that we've experienced over the past several months was also entirely preventable. It would have been very possible for the Congress to create a complete rent holiday and a complete mortgage holiday for as long as they ordered a shutdown due to a perceived medical emergency, meaning that no small business would have to pay their rent for the duration of the shutdown, and no landlord would have to pay their mortgage for the duration of the period that they were not receiving rents. Of course, the banks and the other creditors who own those mortgages as assets would then be complaining. But the federal government can easily make them whole. In fact, the federal government is always using its unlimited spending power to help the banks and creditors. And it did so during this government-induced shutdown. But if you destroy all the small businesses, then that's a whole lot more people who will end up having to go to work in some other large corporation. So this Labor Day, you should understand that there's a deliberate war on labor that's going on, and that has been going on for a long time. And this lockdown is part of it, and its end result is to drive down wages and to drive up indebtedness. Those who deliberately foster policies that create unemployment and indebtedness and the destruction of social infrastructure show themselves to be standing squarely against the gods and the divine powers described in the ancient myths given to every culture on every inhabited continent and island on our earth. And if you read those ancient myths, you will see that that never ends well.